I'm Joanne Wilson, and this is Positively Gotham Gal. Real, honest, and meaningful conversations with women entrepreneurs and their approach to life, business, and everything in between. Alicia Glen is the founder and managing principal at MSquared, a nationwide real estate development and investment platform building the next generation of mixed-use, mixed-income projects in rapidly evolving cities. Alicia is a nationally recognized expert in urban development, infrastructure finance, job creation, and housing policy. She's worked both in the public and private sectors, creating and implementing innovative solutions to enable cities to evolve and grow equitably. Alicia and I got together over Zoom to talk about the role of cities and how to rebuild cities in a post-COVID world.
So we're in the weirdest times.
Yes, and it's fundamentally changing the way we think about how we live and what kind of, society and country we are.
Absolutely everything. And I also think we've all realized that until we have leadership in this country, nothing's changing.
Right. I mean, when you have a country where there's no centralized federal leadership on these issues, if you're a New Yorker like I am or we are, you get so excited that we all did incredibly hard work and went through the worst of this in order to begin to come out of the other end. And then because we have no national policy, we can wind up exactly where we were for absolutely no reason at all, right? Because somebody can get on a plane from Dallas, right? Or somebody can get on a plane from Florida. And that's all it takes for us actually to go backwards. And if we had a centralized, decent public health policy, we would actually maybe be able to start talking about what this looks like when it's over. But I don't think right now we can, given the politics.
You know government extremely well. And I think that a lot of people I think the disappointment with government and not trusting in government started a long time ago, probably way back, amplifying around the Vietnam War. And we've gotten to a point where nobody trusts anybody anymore. Which is quite unfortunate, but there is something at the end of the day that you understand government policy can change the way that we live our lives.
Well, not only can it really has to be the central organizing principle, right? Because no matter what you think in terms of the balance of what the private sector and the public sector should be doing, at the end of the day, what is government? Government is a representation of everybody. And in order to allocate resources and think about health and safety and prosperity and everything that means by that, there has to be some centralized organizing function that in theory represents the collective. Yes. Right? The notion of the collective is what we've really lost, I think, probably since the Vietnam War, or for some communities, they would have said, we never had it. Right. And I think that
for sure,
failure for people to understand that government can be a force for good is a real problem. But one of the silver linings I do hope about COVID is that people now maybe understand the necessity for strong government to do things that again, allocate resources and protect the population and promote, equitable economic growth through central policy making, right? There's no company that's going to do that, right? As much as we want to be thinking that they're market-based solutions to everything, at the end of the day, there aren't. It's got to be the right balance. And maybe people will begin to think we need better, stronger government and smart people.
And I think that a lot of millennials poo-pooed government and said, we'll just do private sector, we'll figure it out. But you really do need government in order to get things accomplished from start to finish.
Yeah. Yeah, and it doesn't mean that there aren't roles for nonprofits and for the market, but at the end of the day, again, these large-scale issues that affect everybody, that's what democracy is, right? I mean, it's like going back to basic principles, from first grade. Why do we have a democracy? Right. To sort of speak for the collective will, and not everybody's always happy, but it does, in theory, represent, what it means to be a democracy in a country. And I think we've lost that, and that's really scary at many levels.
I want to talk about what you have done. I mean, you've really had an interesting career. You were a banker. But, yeah, exactly. Oh. And then you went and, did other things, went into government. But now, you're doing your own thing. And there has been a thread throughout your entire career, because always the dots connect, about thinking about how we live in housing.
Yeah, I have had a very, as I like to think of it, non-linear, but really interesting career, you know, in being, you know, in the private sector, the public sector. I worked in the nonprofit sector for a while, and now I've started my own thing, but there's been a unifying theme, right? And the unifying theme is, I really fundamentally believe that cities are places of opportunity and innovation, and bring out, in many respects, the best of all of us, and give us an opportunity to break down some of the inequities and racism and hierarchies that actually hold us back, and that cities are places where you can really advance a broader agenda. But in order to have really healthy, good cities where all that stuff can happen, the fundamental building block in many ways being able to live there. I mean, in some levels, it's not that deep, right? I mean, people talk a lot about what's a healthy economy and a diversified economy, and I think a lot about that as well. But at the end of the day, your city or your urban economy in your region is only as healthy as the people who can live there and participate in it.
Yes.
And over, you know, it's gone up and down, but I mean, over the past 10 years, you know, the housing crisis in, you know, major metropolitan regions, or gateway cities, as people call them.
By the way, throughout the globe.
Yeah, has just gotten totally out of control. And it is a global issue, but again, this is where the United States often just undermines their own competitiveness, because again, in places like Germany or Singapore or China, they have centralized housing policy, and the government does something about it. And we, as you know, as a general matter, the United States has not really been deeply in the housing business, you know, other than the mortgage interest tax.
Right.
In a big way, right? They've supported home ownership and the American dream, but generally, unlike other major economies that have centralized housing policies, we haven't. And that's taken its toll, because as cities have become more successful, right, coming out of some of the fiscal crises and the white flight of cities and everything, we haven't had a commensurate increase in our housing stock, and it's created this real barbell. You know, we've talked a lot about this, that cities are great places if you're really rich, and cities are places where there are a lot of low-income people who service the economy that allows rich people to have a nice life. And we've really, in a very like statistically significant way, lost a lot of the middle.
Yes.
And the middle is, at the end of the day, what holds us all up, right?
It
and
totally holds us all up. It's the teachers, it's the nurses, it's the EMTs, it's, I mean, all of that is middle income.
Yep.
If you're living 2 hours away, you're not participating in your community. You're just coming in to have a job, and then you go home.
But let's just talk about being a woman for a second, right? It's even worse when you're a woman.
Oh,
Then you have to come home, and you still have to like make dinner and deal with your kids' homework and all the whatever, and the project that you could barely do even if you were home, right? And so these things have a real disparate impact on women, and women are the, you know, a huge percentage of the middle class workforce. And so, you know, it's just not tenable, both for the urban economy, but also for people's like sense of growth, and what are you doing to the next generation of people where their parents are commuting 4 hours a day?
right. Which is the worst.
The worst.
And then even if you continue onward, you know, like you're a policeman or a policewoman, and you're coming in and you're policing a community you know nothing about, and then you retire and you get your pension, you're not living your life in that community. You're taking it back to your suburban life or wherever you're living, and you are putting that money back into that community, not into the community you serviced.
Correct. Again, I think COVID is maybe the time where people are beginning to understand these interdependencies and these connections in ways that they may not have, right? Particularly the double sort of eruption, if you will, of COVID, and then the issues around criminal justice and racism. You talk about community policing, which we're all in favor of, but if there are no cops living in your community because they can't afford to live in your community, you know, you're sort of in the situation, which is what we're talking about, which is what makes a healthy community. And so I think what makes a healthy community and a healthy neighborhood, and not that every neighborhood has to have a percentage of this and a percentage of that, like,
Yes.
yeah, right? Like not everybody's going to be able to live on the Upper East Side or on Central Park West. That's not the point. The point is that, you know, the city is an organism, and it will again, please God, have an amazing mass transit system. And if you live on a subway, you should be able to afford your apartment, send your kid to a decent school, have adequate health care, access to fresh groceries, and be able to walk to a park and get some air. Is that asking too much for the
No,
American
it's not
people?
asking very much.
No, it really isn't. And that's where we need to move and understand why that matters, even to the people who live on Central Park West, because that person has to get to Mount Sinai and save your ass. And
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
I mean, to be true, that's the truth.
That is the truth. So as you obviously have been, deep in the trenches of housing for a very long time and decided, I'm going to do something about this because, it's time in my life. It's my expertise. I've got all the contacts. It's something that I think about all the time, and I'm going to start rebuilding city life from a private sector, even though you have and the best part is you have these relationships with the public sector, right? So you're actually coming at it from someone that they trust and they know you have the knowledge. So talk a little bit about what you are doing, because I think what you're doing is fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, as I said, there are most things in the world that are going to be effective and long-term are some combination of the private sector and the public sector and like the nonprofit or philanthropic sector sort of working together to problem solve, right? I mean, there is a role for collaboration. And I think, having run a big business at Goldman Sachs and been deputy mayor and actually worked as a legal services lawyer, organizing tenants in Brooklyn in the 90s, when things were, a very different Brooklyn than they are now.
Very, very different.
I think you really come to these issues with an understanding, as I say, of like the different perspectives around the table. And what's just become increasingly clear to me in all of those roles is that we need to have a housing policy and a investment vehicle and a partnership that really allows people to invest in, as we were talking about, communities that are truly diverse. And that is both in terms of your income, but like your occupation, right? And really sort of break down the barriers and the sort of artificial lanes that have been created by this notion of like, if you're poor, you live in public housing. If you're wealthy, you live here. If you're a millennial, you sort of live in overly priced housing and you share roommates until you can no longer stand each other. And, there's been very little, although some, and I've been proud to be part of this movement, to really think about how you mix people in a more meaningful way.
And making them feel comfortable with each other.
Yeah. And by the way, part of that is like a sociological, psychological sort of endeavor, but also part of it is, really just breaking down pretty classic stigma, right? I mean, people who grew up in New York, if they're being honest, would be like, what? I always walk around a NYCHA project. I don't walk through a NYCHA project, right? And if they're being honest, they're like, I wouldn't go through a public housing project, right? But, there's so much that we need to begin to break down. But part of the challenge then is how do you come up with a model where the buildings are sustainable, both, in terms of the sociology of a building, but also economically. And so, I thought, I don't see any, I don't really see people out there doing that. So I'm going to form a company because look at the other thing, let's be honest, there's almost no women in this business. I mean, I worked on Wall Street. Wall Street looks like a sorority compared to the real estate business.
Oh yeah. I mean, I know a couple women in it. And when I see women on occasion on a site, I'm always like, go out of my way to say, so great to see you on the site. Like, we're the women.
Yeah. And so I think, all of these things sort of came together. It's like this notion of this is a really non-diverse industry. I've learned a lot about this. I can start a company that tries to address this. And I think that this is a moment where hopefully private capital and the government can get more creative about devising different kinds of models and get out of those two lanes of you're either in low-income affordable housing or the market is being supported by all the tax policy and everything we do in this country, and begin to say, we need to make a longer-term investment in like sustainable housing projects and developments that really, again, allow us to have a truly diverse workforce and a truly diverse set of people.
What can we learn from the projects of the past, right? I think that one of the issues has always been, and we're in such a different role here. There's been no social programs, and these housing projects became really something where a lot of the people living in them were scared to open their doors. Mm-hmm. And so how do we change that? And what do you see as you're talking to cities? Like, what are they looking for and thinking about and using historically to make sure that we don't have places where people aren't going to be like, I'm totally cutting through this neighborhood. They've created this beautiful park in the middle and it's so lovely.
Part of it is a real shift in urban planning, just to get sort of nerdy for a second. But I think that the way the built environment is laid out is incredibly important. And so one of the things that we've learned from the past is, what we call like these, these big campuses or tower in the park that create these sort of more menacing super blocks and areas where you don't have the grid of a city running through it like you would in any other neighborhood, has exacerbated some of these economic and sociological biases that people have, right? Because they're very foreboding, they're very inward looking, they don't literally connect to the street. Like in my neighborhood, the housing authority has a bunch of big development projects, and you literally have to walk 4 blocks around it, or you have to go through some crazy path through it, and it feels like not what you would normally do, right? So
you don't want to go in there.
Yeah, and you literally just think about the way you are in an urban environment. So I think there's a huge piece around urban design and how communities either are welcoming and like part of the broader grid or neighborhood, or they become closed in. And I think, so one of the things that's really important for the work we do, and I think smart development, is you'll see really good projects come down to the sidewalk. They have a street wall that's inviting. There's retail, there's a community center, there's transparency, right? A lot of low-income housing from the 60s and 70s, it looks almost fortress-like. And they're literally often like gates and fences. And so what does that do to you as a kid growing up there, right? Like, just think about that.
That you should go outside your property.
Yeah. So, so urban design is really important, and making sure that you have the right layouts and grid and what we call transparency on the street wall. And I think by having a mix of incomes in the building, just your whole experience, like, I don't know, like when I grew up in a pretty nice, neighborhood and grew up in Central Park West, but like there were lawyers and doctors and social workers and writers, and we were all like in a little play group, right? And we would like run around the basement, and like do, and cause trouble, but we had a great time. But it was ironically, even though now it's such a high-end neighborhood, my role modeling and who I hung out with as a kid, and we would like run around and we went to PS 84. I think that it's really important to match the physical urban design with the mix of people in the building. And so you begin to develop a whole different sort of socioeconomic dynamic.
Yeah, no, Stuyvesant Town.
Yeah.
Actually, when I was in the city last time, I walked through Stuyvesant Town, sat there, had a coffee, and I was so enamored with all the parks and the people and everything going on there, and it felt so good. And even though those buildings are really ugly, but the parks that they created around it, you do feel very good about walking in there. And they've now created a bunch of ground spaces that are cafes, and they've created new parks. And
you have to activate that's what I mean by transparency and activation, so that it doesn't look foreboding, it looks inviting.
Yeah.
And they've done a lot of work there to sort of make it look less like an old school, what we call campus tower in the park construction, and sort of fill it in a way that feels more familiar to New Yorkers, like when you walk around, and you're not like, oh my God, now I'm in a housing project, right?
Right. No, you don't feel that way.
It announce itself as a housing project, whereas so much of the older stuff does. And again, I just always think about how kids, I'm not a PhD in psychology, but just the way kids experience that. And so the better buildings are different. They just really are.
Yeah, they really are. For sure. When they gave away all that property through the 19th RFP that they did below Canal.
Essex Crossing, the big Essex Crossing project.
Yeah, the big Essex Crossing.
Yep.
They finally actually issued, and things are coming up out of the ground. Was anything integrated into how they were going to do that project?
Yeah, I often use it as a case study of really smart, inclusive,
Whoever ran it did. I know you were involved in that, but even the reopening of Essex Market,
huge.
They did an incredible job. Bringing old, bringing new. Really, really smart.
Yeah, no, I would argue that's one of the better examples of like being able to maintain the authenticity of the original use and still also upgrade it. Because often what happens, you know, in these projects is like all the old timers get kicked out and then it gets like so yuppified that it loses its terroir, its legitimacy, its authenticity. And we work so hard. I worked on the deal both on the Goldman side, ironically, and then when I became deputy mayor, but we absolutely insisted, and this is why the public sector matters. The public sector insisted that 2/3 of the space in the new Essex market was reserved for people who were in the old Essex market. And they would have to be cross-subsidized by the new yupsters. That's just the right thing to do, because otherwise you throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? So, you know, that project really shows, and there's low-income senior housing in that project. There's mixed income rental housing. There's some actual moderate income home ownership there. There's a Trader Joe's. And that is an example of sort of what I'm doing.
Rebuilding the city.
Yeah, on crack, if you will. That's why I'm probably going to get chastised for using that. But, you know, that's a multi-phase 10 building project that took about 25 years. Please God, it doesn't take 25 years to get other projects done. But the politics were complicated, but finally came together. And I think that represents a really good model for large scale, thoughtful, mixed income, mixed use development that really respects place, but also doesn't keep you trapped in the old bad ways.
Right, right.
And we got ICP, which is really exciting to move down from Midtown. To have ICP there was a great thing. And we have a senior center. It's a great project.
That's amazing. So when you think about, as you're going to start developing more of these projects, and you're talking to cities across the country who are saying, you know, you're an expert in this, you're going to build these projects, you know, maybe you're the one who's going to do this for us and win this RFP. What are you thinking about? And is it everything is state by state in regards to these conversations? Are they flowing up to the federal level?
Yes, no, and no. It's a real matrix. I mean, not to get nerdy, but you know, there are federal programs and resources that are available, you know, to all states. States use them differently, and certainly over the past, you know, since certainly in the Trump administration and even a little bit before, federal resources have not been.
Oh, they've dried up.
Yeah, they haven't been that plentiful. Let's just call it what it is. And so more and more states and localities are trying to figure out how to do this stuff. And they use a lot of different tools, and they use their property and their zoning. And so the answer is, you know, at the end of the day, for this kind of work to really scale, we do need federal resources, and we need federal policy. You know, and part of the debate that's going on right now in the real nerdy trenches of this election is, you know, if the Democrats win, are they going to really increase the amount of money allocated towards providing more people with affordable housing? I mean, that's a big expense item, right? That is a fundamental shift.
But if you have transportation bill and your ability to put everyone to work in a different way, or put hospitals with money and bring more jobs in, then they pay taxes, and it all works itself out.
Correct. But I mean, I'll give you an example. Now, Austin is a city that's exploding, and I've spent a lot of time down there, and it's it's a place that everybody thinks is so cool and so funky and so wonderful, and everybody wants to live there. But the downside of that is they are increasingly in a serious affordable housing crisis, where people have lived there forever are getting pushed out because all, you know, with Apple coming in and Facebook and all the big tech companies, the city hasn't had a really smart housing policy to increase density and to build more housing and to build more affordable housing. So I spent a lot of time down there and talking to the mayor and the council. And to your point, they're like, well, this is all great, and we are changing our land use code, and we're going to do a lot to encourage density and affordable housing, but we have a problem, Alicia, that you, of course, would think is crazy. We have no mass transit. They have no public transportation.
I know they don't. It's
Zero.
insane.
It's insane. So
I mean, it doesn't take much to put above rail in. It's like putting in a gondola. It only takes 8 weeks.
I mean, they have no public transportation. So here we are lecturing them and sort of enlightening them and all of the things about great mixed use, mixed income projects. And they're like, well, that's great, but we need 7,000 parking spaces, to which I say, no, we don't want any parking spaces. So the point, which is, if we have a federal government that also supports urban public transportation projects, that will also begin to allow some of these housing issues to blossom, because they're so interconnected. And
Right.
that's why we do need federal leadership, but each jurisdiction has their own thing, right? And you're never going to get everybody in Dallas out of their car, but you might get more people on the light rail if the light rail actually ran more than 3 hours a day and was a decent system.
Yes, you know, or there's not even a question. I mean, it's changed LA. It's surpassed everyone's expectations.
Express buses. I mean, actual people take express buses now. And there's lots of BRT called bus rapid transit. You can do that really easily by segregating lanes. They do it in Europe, all over the place. I mean, we're really so nowhere in this country when it comes to mass transit. It's embarrassing.
It is embarrassing. I mean, you go to other countries. I mean, Switzerland, I guess, is an ideal, but like you can land at the airport in Zurich. You can get out, get on a above rail car, constantly coming, take it to the train station, get on the train station, go to your house that might be an hour outside of Zurich, an hour and a half, get off, walk through the city, pick up your meat, pick up your wine, pick up your vegetables, walk home. No car, ever.
I know, fabulous. So, I think this is the thing, is housing is the fundamental building block, but it needs all this other scaffolding, right? And these other supports. And so at the end of the day, look at the local and state governments can't build enormous mass transportation systems. That is a federal responsibility,
It is.
with local participation. I mean, we know how much money they put into highways, right? So this is not like in our heads as lefties, this is real. You could choose different things. And so I think the combination of a serious urban mass transit policy shift and some thinking about using housing resources to serve more renters instead of focusing so much on home ownership, and also thinking about expanding the range of incomes that the programs serve. If those things come together and we have smart capitalists who understand that having a more patient approach to investing in these projects ultimately lifts all of us, and not in a I'm just like, I feel good about myself meditative way, but like investing in projects that allow cities to have the kinds of workforce and the sort of health outcomes that we want actually it makes the world safe for capitalism. I mean,
100%. These are long-term decisions. I mean, the problem is politicians have tended all their lives short-term decisions because it's only on their watch. Why make a decision when I'm going to be retired and I'm not going to get the accolades or be able to raise the money for myself during those times?
Well, that's why infrastructure and mass transit, and particularly, has always suffered, because these systems take years to plan.
Years.
And so you're already out of office, so you barely even get invited to the ribbon cutting, or the groundbreaking for the subway. It's like you're already building your presidential library.
Right.
So it's particularly challenging in the United States, again, where we don't have longevity and we don't have a parliamentary system where a party can stay in power for a long period of time and have a national infrastructure agenda.
Although we might see the Democrats, very similar to the Republicans, be in power for a very extended, long period of time, while the Republicans try to rethink who is the Republican Party.
From your lips to God's ears.
For sure. Let's hope so. But I'm hopeful that Americans, at least ones that are living in urban cities, that are looking around of what's happening in their cities. I mean, we've even read multiple articles of smaller cities that people are out protesting, and others in the city are like, I had no idea how we had this here, right? And, but like you look, I mean, when we were in California during the beginnings of the pandemic, every day we would take a walk because, of course, you just need to get out. And the one thing that was clear to me, and I was hearing this from people in the city too, is that when you walk into an area that usually has 200 people roaming around, you don't see all the inequities. You just see 200 people roaming around. And when the only thing left are 15 people that are crazy people that need serious help, and you're seeing this every single day, and all I can think of is like, oh my God, where's this person living? Why aren't we helping this person? Everyone needs a roof over their house, their head, and we need to rethink how we take care of our people. And so I do believe that the government needs to be there, but the people have to push for the government to make those changes.
I think that's right. And that goes back to where we started, right? Which is like, in theory, a democracy represents what, in theory, the will of the people is. And maybe the will of the people now is going to change a little bit away from just their own pure self-interest, right? natural thing, but to say, you know what? We as a country need to allocate more resources to like mental health. I mean, half the people you're seeing roaming around in New York City or in LA who are homeless literally are people who need very serious psychiatric intervention, right?
Oh my God, yes.
And that's what it's about. And like, that's about like, why do we have a health system where people don't get taken care of in the United States of America? I mean, it's absolutely outrageous and crazy. And then there's a slew of people who are homeless because they're economically homeless, because there's not enough housing. And you sort of got to think about those two things differently. But either way, right, you have to say to yourself, you know what, I'm going to vote to raise my taxes. It's as simple as that. Or I'm going to vote for somebody who's going to make a decision to spend money on psychiatric care versus, you know, I mean, it's almost like, you know, college, first day of college, but like, do you really need to increase the Pentagon's budget, or do you want to actually provide psychiatric care to people who are roaming the streets? Those are choices we make.
Those are choices we make. And I am hopeful, I mean, which is what I love what you're doing, is that we are at this turning point where everything must change. And we need to rethink as a young country how we got to where we are, how we look at our history, and how we don't repeat it, but integrate it into how we can make ourselves better.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, because the counterfactual is pretty ugly.
I mean, if we just continue going down this road, we're going to be like Rio or, you know, Brazil or Venezuela, where the wealthy people are living behind gated communities and everyone else is fending for themselves.
Yeah, no, it has a sort of a dystopian quality that I don't even like to talk about because it makes me so upset. And yet having those, you know, sometimes fear is a good motivator. And I think that, again, in a weird way, and God knows nobody should have died unnecessarily in COVID, but it was a little taste of dystopia. And I think that.
And the reality of our hospitals. I mean, who said to me, who knew that every single industry in our entire country, besides, of course, you know, Facebook or, you know, Twitter or some of these large tech companies, 2 weeks, they're fucked after 2 weeks, you know, restaurants and social services and nonprofits and parks and on and on and on and on. And, you know, that's like, you know, the Warren Buffett saying, which is like, when the tide pulls back, you can see who's naked. And we look very naked.
I think you said it well. I mean, it's so much more precarious than any person would have ever thought, because because we're all actually, you know, sort of patriots, right? At some level. And we think, you know, it can't be that America can collapse in 2 weeks. Like, how can this be, right?
How can this be?
And yet it is so precarious, and it, you know, people talk about, you know, people who live from paycheck to paycheck. I would argue that we've sort of, the huge swaths of the economy have been living paycheck to paycheck, and it hasn't been going so well.
Right.
It makes you think sort of fundamentally about how we're reorganizing, you know, many, many different things, but certainly the healthcare system and the social service sector, you know, they can't be in a position where literally they have to fire every single geriatric social worker the same time that old people are stuck in their home because they're not allowed out of their home.
I'm hoping that we're sort of at that juncture as well. And I'm really excited to watch what you do with all this, because I am, so is Fred, obviously, a huge fan of recreating our cities so that we're all equal. We all have a roof. We all have food on the table. And again, it doesn't mean that all of us can live on Central Park West, but that's okay. You know?
That's like, I mean, that's why I think people get sort of caught up in these, like, you know, really ridiculous debates. It's like, well, what do you mean? Does that mean you're getting rid of first class on airplanes? I'm like, what does it have to do with anything? That's so dumb. All I'm talking about, like, being a nation with the wealthiest, you know, per capita GDP, other than, you know, Norway, of which there's 3 people, which is the equivalent of living on my block. How could it be that, like, you're a crazy socialist by saying people should have a decent place to live, food on their plate, and be able to get their kids vaccinated and go to the doctor? Like, what does it have to do with getting rid of first class? So I think that, you know, we really have to get out of this binary discussion. And there's just a basic level of, you know, people talk about living wage or sort of your basic human rights as an American are really in jeopardy. And I think that COVID has shown that. By the way, so did Hurricane Katrina. You know, so did all these other things where it's like there's whole classes of people. We're not talking about one or two people wandering down Broadway in front of Zabar's or crazy. Whole communities that you could argue whose human rights are not being respected. And it's not okay.
Yeah, I totally agree. So, you know, here's a toast to like, let's hope that when we come out on the other side, which could be a good 8 more months, I mean, as crazy as that sounds, that we will have a government that actually does have passion for their fellow man or woman.
And people, and again, it can't just be the government. It's also got to be capitalists. It's got to be market makers. It's got to be people who understand that this is, you can't put it all on the government. It has to be.
It has to be from the private sector too.
Yeah,
100%.
right. As I say, if you're short-term greedy, you're long-term screwed. And, you know, you sort of need to, you know, can't day trade all day. You got to sort of decade trade. And that's really important, I think.
I like it. Well, thanks for coming on. This is a great conversation, and I'm sure we'll be having many more of them.
I want to thank Alicia for joining me on Positively Gotham Gal this week. And if you'd like to learn more about MSquared, you can visit them at buildmsquared.com.